Good morning, everybody. This is Jim Ransom doing another episode of what I call Morning Jim, which is some poetry reading. We're going to read poems old and new, and first I'm going to read a poem by T.S. Eliot. I've avoided T.S. Eliot so far because although I like T.S. Eliot, he's not the easiest poet to understand. He wrote for an audience of academics and aficionados of poetry, and not for a general audience until later in his career. He decided to write poems about cats. He always loved cats and had a lot of them. And these poems later were made into a famous musical called Cats that appeared after Eliot had gone to his reward. And he would have been, I think, proud of what was done with his poems. I know Marcia and I attended a performance of Cats in London once, many years ago, and it was magnificent. It was great. The Cats cast was dressed in cat-like costumery, and some of the scenes included the songsters walking up and down the aisles of the theater, and so forth. It was a wonderful show. Eliot himself was an interesting person. He would have been a hard person to be around because I think he was a heavy smoker, and in the day and age in which he smoked, he was exposed to a lot of smoke in the atmosphere of London, where he lived most of his life. Although he was the son of a Boston Brahmin family, he was actually born in St. Louis, Missouri, where his father had gone for reasons I won't elaborate on. He himself went to a boys' school when he was young in St. Louis, and then on to Harvard, and graduated from Harvard, at which time he was a committed writer, which didn't necessarily please his parents. But he went off to Paris at that point, and then to England, where he had a degree from Oxford, and he spent time at Cambridge. He knew classical Latin and Greek, of course, and also mastered French and German and Italian. Phew! After all of that, you might have imagined that he would become a professor of something or another. But no, he had a hard time supporting himself, so he went to work for a bank in London at a very low salary. And so he did a lot of writing and eventually some lecturing and reading and selling his books, and gradually became more self-sustaining over time. You can find more about Eliot online. There are many entries, and you can still buy the title Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. So you can read the great cat poems. Sadly, most of them are too long to read here, and they're available being read online by people with more performance talent than I have. So go and do that. It's worth it. The poem I am going to read from Eliot is one that he wrote in his younger years, well, before 1920, while he was in London, where he eventually became a British citizen, and he renounced his American citizenship, so he didn't have dual citizenship. He was a Brit through and through at that point in his life. I'm going to read the poem called, it's from this book with no title on it except on the binding, Collected Poems of T.S. Eliot from 1909 to 1935. I got this book when I was in college at Stanford, and I think I paid $1 for it. It's hardbound. The poem is called La Figlia Che Piange, and in Italian, of course, and that means the weeping girl. Eliot never bothered to translate any of his titles or his epigrams. The epigram for this poem is O quam te memoram virgo, which means, oh, what shall I call you? And it's apt for this poem, as we'll see. And here's the poem. Stand on the highest pavement of the stair, lean on a garden urn, weave the sunlight in your hair, clasp your flowers to you with a pained surprise, fling them to the ground and turn with a fugitive resentment in your eyes, but weave the sunlight in your hair. So I would have had him leave. So I would have had her stand and grieve. So he would have left, as the soul leaves the body torn and bruised, as the mind deserts the body it has used. I should find some way incomparably light and deft, some way we both should understand, simple and faithless as a smile and a shake of the hand. She turned away, but with the autumn weather compelled my imagination many days and many hours, her hair over her arms and her arms full of flowers. And I wonder how they should have been together. I should have lost her gesture and a pose. Sometimes these cogitations still amaze the troubled midnight in the noon's repose. Okay, now, what in the world is that all about? It exists on several different levels, but the most important thing you need to know about this is that Eliot, frequently in his earlier poems, he wrote from a detached angle, from the point of view of a narrator who was not actually in the poem itself. And that's what's going on here. Imagine that the person writing this poem or reading this poem is a painter, or perhaps even a photographer who's been engaged to come to a garden where he's to paint a picture or take a photograph of a beautiful woman holding a bouquet of flowers, and she's with her lover or her fiancé, and they have a disagreement, and she flings her flowers to the ground and turns with resentment in her eyes. And so then the narrator is trying to think about all the things he should have done to be able to complete his charge. So I would have had him leave, so I would have had her stand and grieve. So he would have left, as the soul leaves the body torn and bruised, as the mind deserts the body. I should find some incomparable light and deft way we both should understand, simple and faithless as a smile or a shake of the hand, to complete our job, is what he's saying. But it all fell through. And then the narrator is wondering how the two of them would have been together in his photograph or painting. And he says at the end, sometimes these cogitations still amaze the troubled midnight and the noon's repose. He's grieving over the scenes that he should have and could have made with his paints or his photos. So you can see it's a complex poem, and many of his poems were like that. He wrote parts of some of his poems in French, so you'd have to know French in order to read them, unless you had a French friend who could interpret them for you. And then he wrote a poem called The Wasteland, which was considered his masterpiece of his early years. And unless you had a tremendously thorough grounding in the literature of Western civilization, you would never understand a word of it, or scarcely anyway. Eliot himself wrote 12 pages of notes on the Wasteland. And these notes are reproduced in this book, where he sort of explains what he's doing. And then after you've read the notes, and of course you can't even read the notes unless you know some foreign languages. For example, one of the notes explaining a section that he's written is an entry from Hermann Hesse, a German poet, and it's titled Blick ins Chaos. And it starts out, Schön ist halb Europa. Well, I mean, my German's not all that good, and I'm not going to read any of that, but I'm just trying to give you the idea that in the Wasteland, to understand it, you probably would have to understand at least the languages that Eliot understood, and you'd have to be able to deal with his text and interpret it. I went through that poem when I was a young student, and fortunately it was not a class assignment. It was an extra thing that you could do. But I did pretty well with the Wasteland, but finally I had to throw up my hands and say, I can't afford to spend the rest of my college career going through this poem. So Eliot is certainly a poet worth knowing, and some of his earlier poems are a lot easier to deal with, like The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock or Portrait of a Lady. They're all in English, and they're all a little bit like La Figlia Che Piange, in that they have a narrator format, and you never know exactly who the narrator is, but if you understand that you're outside the poem and you're looking in at these people who are pinned and wriggling on the wall, you can sort of understand where he's coming from. They're not exactly happy poems. Cats is his happy poem. Took him a long time to get there, too. Well, we're going to go someplace else for the next poem. It's going to be a poem from Winter's Yield. And you've seen this book before, Janet's book, Janet Jenkins-Stotts. Janet's going to be moving here to the same retirement community where I am in the near future, or at least that's what she tells me. But Janet is very good at writing in some of the Japanese formats, such as haiku and tanka. Now, I'm not going to go through an explanation of what a tanka is, except that it's like a lot of Japanese poetry. it's a short form of a poem, but it has very strict rules for how many syllables you can have in a line and how many lines you must have in a poem, and so on. Tanka is a Japanese word for a short song, and it consists of 31 syllables. I will go that far. So here's a tanka from Jenkins-Stotts Jenkins. It's called Fishing. Drop my wormed hook in shallow water. The result is quick but small. Throw it back and catch another. Repeat. Fish are slow learners. I think that's very clever. And one more tanka from Janet. It's called Weather Forecast. Yesterday, rain was forecast. It didn't rain at all at my house. Today, no rain was forecast. It poured. Welcome, my friends, to Kansas. I think that's a lovely little poem. Thank you, Janet. For the last poem today, we're going to go somewhere completely different. I don't think I've read anything before by Dylan Thomas. Many of you are going to be familiar with Dylan Thomas. He was a Welsh genius, poet, and he read poems, his own and others, at the BBC during World War II. And I think with all the bombs going off in the distance, he ended up that job with what today we would call PTSD. He came to the United States by invitation of a lot of the literati here and was wined and dined, became an alcoholic if he wasn't already one. And his life, I think, was foreshortened considerably by that trip. I read this poem at my father's funeral. It's one of Dylan Thomas's most familiar poems. Do not go gentle into that good night. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now. With your fierce tears I pray, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. That poem, for those of you, and that's many of us, that are not poetry aficionados, this is a French form called a villanelle. And just briefly, it starts out, do not go gentle into that good night, is the first line of the first stanza, and then the last line of the first stanza is rage, rage against the dying of the light. Now, as you go down with each succeeding stanza, those two lines alternate as the ending of the next stanza, until at the end, the two lines themselves are together at the end of the poem. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. A beautiful villanelle and a poem that I've always loved. Okay, we've come to the end of this session. It's gone a little over time, I suspect. I apologize for that. I hope you enjoy the upcoming week. And here's my blessing for the Advent season. If you're not a Christian, you won't care, but it's a blessing nevertheless. I hope to see you next week, and I'll have a completely different set of poems at that time. Bye now.